Hey guys, it's Chris, and I'm back with another video. This time I want to talk about The Last Dance. The first two episodes have now aired on ESPN. As many of you know, we don't do a lot of sports here. Occasionally on the podcast, James and I do. We did episode 23 on Michael Jordan, and then, of course, the tragedy happened with Kobe right after, just by happenstance, and we did episode 24 on Kobe. But I want to talk about The Last Dance because many of you know I'm a huge Michael Jordan fan. You know, I grew up watching him play since college. My mom got me into basketball. I was a basketball player, and like many people, I modeled my game after him, or tried to at least. And he inspired a lot of people. So I wanted to talk about the first two episodes of The Last Dance. I've been looking forward to this now for a long time. I mean, they started teasing this a couple years ago, and then they bumped it up earlier. And I'm glad they did during this coronavirus mess. And by the way, I hope everybody's safe out there. It looks like it's finally getting a little better, so hopefully soon enough we'll be back to our normal lives. But this is kind of why I wanted to talk about it, actually, because it shows you the importance of sports, and specifically with Chicago Bulls, obviously, in this particular documentary. But, sports is something that brings us together, and a lot of people don't like sports. I've heard a lot of people say, it's just, rich athletes getting paid to play a game, and it's a lot more than that. I don't want to get necessarily all that stuff. I do want to talk about documentary, but I want to touch on some of that stuff as well. So obviously this is going to center around Michael Jordan, but I really like how this is going to be like, a team series. So you can see how they're setting it up. The first episode was about Jordan, a little bit of his background for people who may not know yet, with all the different documentaries and, specials that came out on him during the years. But they set that up with him, and then episode 2 was a lot more about Pippen, and I believe episode 3 will be a lot more about Rodman and things like that. So they're kind of, building it around Jordan and the other main players, but they're also including, the secondary role players and all that stuff, which I think is really important because this is a team thing. Now, obviously, to me, Jordan is the GOAT, the greatest of all time, and I think all the stats and numbers and errors and all that good stuff support that, and I don't want to get into that here. Obviously, there's still some debate. I don't really think there's much of one anymore, but the point being that, obviously it's going to center around him because he is who he is, and he had such a huge impact. But I will say really quickly, before I get into this documentary, even though that Jordan is my favorite player of all time, and it took me down memory lane for sure already, the greatest documentary to me in sports is the Magic and Bird documentary, A Courtship of Rivals, because contrary to what a lot of people say who are Jordan supporters, Michael Jordan didn't save the NBA. Magic Johnson and Larry Bird saved the NBA. Now, Jordan, yes, he took it international a little bit more, obviously with the Olympics, and Dream Team helped with that too, but he took it to another level. But Magic and Bird saved the NBA, and that is one of my all-time favorite documentaries in sports, all-time period, actually. And I've seen it probably 20 or 30 times. But this may shape up to be a very close runner-up, if not better. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. But I like the idea that what's crazy to me is that they filmed this entire 97-98 championship season, The Last Dance, as Phil Jackson labeled it in his handout to the team at the beginning of the season. We all kind of had heard about all this kind of stuff, but it's going to be really interesting to see behind the scenes because nobody knew they filmed all this stuff during the whole entire season. So we're going to see what it takes for a team, an organization, to win a championship, especially 6 championships in 8 years. And I don't think anybody would argue if he didn't go play baseball, it would have been 8 in 8 years. I don't think anybody would really argue with that. But I really like this idea of this real behind-the-scenes look at, 80s and 90s basketball, or basketball in general, being behind the scenes there as a team goes on this quest to win a championship. We know what it looks like throughout the season. The politics in the background, the ownership versus the players, all that good stuff. I mean, obviously, here with the Bulls, I mean, if you're a Bulls fan, already know, you heard about Jerry Krause and Reinsdorf and the issues they had with Jordan and Pippen, and they didn't really get along for most of their careers after Jordan got hurt and tried to hold him back from playing. And I understand why they did it. Obviously, they explained that in this particular episode as well. But, they're really going to go into more of the political side of things, too, and Reinsdorf. And you're really going to see a lot of more in-depth, I think, during this documentary, the tension there and what really went on, or at least a better understanding of what went on with Jerry Krause trying to break up the Bulls, which, in fact, he ultimately did. But his relationship with Scottie Pippen and Phil Jackson and Michael Jordan and the other players. But I will say this up front, you got to give Jerry Krause credit as well because he put this team together. He drafted Scottie Pippen. He went after these other players. As a matter of fact, he's the one that got Tony Kukoc before he came to the NBA overseas in Europe. And when the Dream Team happened and we went to the Olympics with pros for the first time, Jordan and Pippen locked him down, literally didn't let him score a point or hardly even touch the ball because they knew that Krause was looking to bring on Tony Kukoc to the NBA and the Chicago Bulls specifically. So they wanted to make a point. So they had already had their issues, obviously, going on during that era. And he did make that statement that was kind of controversial. It takes more than players to win a championship or whatever. And I think to a degree that's fair, but the way he said it, or at least the way it was portrayed, was kind of shitty because ultimately it is about the players who put their bodies on the line to do this, night in and night out to bring the actual championship. They're the ones out there shooting jump shots and driving to the rim and getting beat down and, breaking bones and whatever. So anyway, I really like how they're, going into that. We're going to see some of that, but I also want to be fair about it and get his side of the story. But yeah, this was a trip down memory lane for me and a lot of people, I'm sure. My cousin and I were live texting during some of this as well. And we were both huge Jordan fans. He's a little younger than me, and he came up, and kind of followed my footsteps throughout school and basketball. And I obviously followed Jordan, emulated him, as I mentioned. And it had such a huge impact on people. And that's one thing that's changed so much today. There's still great NBA players, and the NBA is in a really good place. It's just a different era. It's a different style of basketball. It's the era of the guards, the smaller teams. So I hope people take a look at this also and appreciate the 80s and 90s games and how different it was, how much more physical it was. I hope they get into some of that stuff as well. The era of the big man essentially ended after this, and that's just the way it was. But yeah, I mean, it's really important to take a look at some of these things, and this is kind of the things that shape people and that shaped who you are. And in those days, at least, I think there's a lot less of that these days. In those days, you dreamed, you had a dream, and whether it was an athlete or an astronaut or whatever, sports are important in that aspect. It lets people dream and start to think about things they can do with their lives. Now, most people will never make it to the NBA, myself included, obviously, but it allowed me to work hard and learn work ethic and, camaraderie and all the good things that go along with being on a basketball team since I was very young and played in, Y League all the way up until college. The point being that, you learn a lot of life lessons from sports. Being a part of competition is huge. It's really, really important in the development of a young man or a woman or whatever, and learning that aspect of life, how to lose, how to win, sportsmanship, all that good stuff. There's so many life lessons. So it's not just a damn game where a bunch of rich dudes are playing a game for a living. I mean, in the essence of the entertainment aspect, sure. But the point is that it's really, really important, and these are real people with real dreams who a lot of times came from nothing, and I think that's a powerful story. So I think that's why it's important for people to watch this, even though they may not be huge basketball fans or sports fans, but kind of see the what's going on behind the scenes to bring your city or whatever entertainment and championships or whatever that may be. And ultimately, it brings people together, and that's the bottom line. I mean, I think a lot of people are feeling that right now with the coronavirus going on, and people are in isolation. A lot of things are shut down, and I think people are starting to push back on that a lot because they're missing these types of sporting events and stuff, and it brings a city together, or even a country for that matter. For example, I live in North Carolina. We didn't have a pro team until I was a little bit older. So I pulled for the Chicago Bulls because I followed Jordan throughout college, throughout Carolina, because my mom introduced me to Michael Jordan when he was a freshman at Carolina. And, of course, him being a North Carolina native and all that kind of stuff, I mean, he was the hometown hero for a lot of people. And I think that's important. I think it's important to acknowledge that and understand that and try to understand why people love sports so much, why they're so passionate about it, because ultimately it brings people together. It gives you something to follow. It doesn't matter what your political background is, where you work, how much money you make. When it's time for game night, you're all on the same team. And I think that's hugely important and powerful for people in today's society especially. You saw it in episode 1. You saw it. It was his background. It was his upbringing with his parents, and all that good stuff. And that says a lot about society today, what people need. Kids need to be successful. They need to learn to fail. And I think that's really, really important. That's something that's missing out of today's society. And you saw, through the stories, the personal stories between the battles of, Larry Jordan versus Michael Jordan in the backyard and the fights. he had to fail. He had to get cut from that team. Otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. This documentary would not be on TV. I think it's important to kind of look back at the days when, everybody did not get a participation trophy, when you actually had to win. I think this is really, really important. And that's one thing I don't understand about today's society, where everybody gets a damn participation trophy, because ultimately you're just hurting the people you're giving the trophy to. But obviously there in this, we're going to see, a lot about his legacy. It's going to say a lot about who he was as a teammate. He's going to be very hard on people. He's going to cuss them out. He's going to hold them to a certain standard. They got in physical altercations. If you're a Bulls fan or a basketball fan, you've probably heard all the stories about practice being more intense than games. I mean, that's what it takes to be a real leader when your ultimate goal is to win championships. And that was the mentality of people like Michael Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird. It was a championship mentality. And then, of course, you had your Kobe Bryants. Kobe Bryant would not be who he was as a great in the game, in my opinion, the second or third greatest of all time, if it wasn't for people like Michael Jordan that he looked up to as well. So, this success breeds more success, and it's really important to look at these legacies and see what they do for other people. These are the guys who go out on the floor every night with sprained ankles and hurt and whatever, sick. It doesn't matter, but they have to play not only because it's their job, because they have that sense of pride to do so, and they know there may be a kid in that stand watching them who may gain inspiration, and maybe they don't become a pro basketball player, but they grow up with that work ethic and change the damn world. But I also think it's really cool they're bringing in Scottie Pippen and Dennis Rodman and Steve Kerr and Luke Longley and all these other players, that helped build this thing, because he couldn't have done it alone. He is the only player in the history of the game who had some kind of mental switch where he could take over a game when he chose, at will, literally, 99.9% of the time. But it did take all these other role players, and that was the great thing about the Bulls dynasty and other dynasties before them. Everybody knew their place, but that's just what it took to win championships. Obviously, in episode 2, it followed more about Pippen. We got a little bit more backstory on Pippen. A lot of us already knew this kind of stuff as far as being Bulls fans in the day, but you got a lot more detail also, and you're going to get more into that as well in his drama with Jerry Krause specifically. I think it ended right there when, Jordan was saying he thought Scottie was being selfish at that time, where he was demanding to be traded or whatever. And I understand that. He did have a shitty contract. I think it was 7 years for $18 million, which is very, very low at the time. And Jordan had just got paid. But before that as well, they didn't really mention that Jordan was actually a very low-paid player throughout his entire career until the end, whenever his contract was up or whatever. Then he got that big kind of money. And so I understand that, from one perspective. But the other hand, you did make a promise to come back to the team, and you signed the contract. So we'll see if they continue to talk about that. I'm sure they will in episode 3, because I think this is where Rodman comes in during the third three-peat in this season, obviously, where Rodman kind of, being the outcast that he seemingly was a huge part of Chicago Bulls basketball in that era. And he's the one that really held this team together when Pippen was out for those 2 or 3 months. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see episode 3 and how, behind the scenes Dennis Rodman fit in, because I love Dennis Rodman. I think Dennis Rodman is a very, very underrated basketball player overall. Obviously, he is known for rebounding and defense, because that's his specialty, and he took a lot of pride in that. Well, let me tell you, Dennis Rodman could play offense back in the day when he wanted to. I used to hate him on the Pistons. If you're a Bulls fan, you used to hate Dennis Rodman, but I always respected the hell out of Dennis Rodman, because I've always really wondered how they got along. And they always say they got along great, but they just didn't talk a lot unless they were on the court. Sure, they have different personalities, but that was the genius of Phil Jackson. So I hope people, can learn a lot from Phil Jackson as well. Of course, he went on to coach the Lakers, who won, Kobe won his 5 championships under Phil Jackson, and a lot of that success is due to somebody like Phil Jackson, able to manage all these big egos. I mean, that was the thing, and keep them all on the same page. So he created this Last Dance idea anyway to kind of create an us versus them mentality, the players down here doing all the work versus the front office, and that's why they won this championship under those circumstances, knowing that this was the last year they're going to do it. And also one more thing I wanted to say is that I do hope that some of the younger generation will watch this and gain some appreciation for 80s and 90s basketball. I know there's a lot of basketball channels out there that explain this type of thing. And, it was the big man mentality back then. You even heard them say when they drafted Jordan, well, we wish he was 7'1", because that was the mentality back in the day. And it was just a different game. It was a lot more physical. You'll see some, during some of this footage, obviously, the hard fouls. We hadn't even got to the Pistons yet because they kind of keep rewinding in time and going back to what, built up to this particular season. And so I want people to kind of get a better appreciation for why a lot of us old school people, they call us, I guess, whatever, say that the NBA was so much more tough in the 80s and 90s and physical, because it was. The rule changes, it's a real thing. It has a real effect on the game. And I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that today's NBA is bad by any means. I just think that today's fans that really didn't get a chance to see Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson and Larry Bird and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and those players back in the olden golden days, the old era of the big man, so to speak, I don't think they have a real understanding and appreciation, because you don't have, first of all, the footage. You don't have their HD highlights and the angles and all that stuff to kind of see all the detail in the game and how it worked back then, and triangle offenses and all that kind of stuff as far as the Bulls go specifically. And now it's really presented well as far as the game goes and all the camera angles. You can really see the clarity and stuff. Because I can understand for a younger person, let's say, going back and they hear about Michael Jordan, who only grew up watching, LeBron James or even Kobe in the later years or whatever, and they go back and see this old VHS footage of Michael Jordan. You can't really see all that, clearly. You can't see, some of the artistry there in motion or whatever you want to call it. You can't see the height, the hops that he had compared to LeBron, for example. Even though Jordan has the highest vertical in NBA history at 48 inches, you couldn't see that with some of the camera angles and stuff like that. So I hope people can go back and take a look at this and at least gain some kind of appreciation, maybe look into it a little bit more about some of the arguments that go on online about who's the GOAT, who's the greatest. Well, these players in this era wasn't really that good compared to these days when, everybody's got handles and everything's, a lot faster. Let me tell you something really quick, though, on that. I've said this to a couple of my family members who are younger and didn't quite understand this as well. Those players back in the day had the same handles, or even better in some cases. They just didn't show it off because it just wasn't a thing to go behind your back when it wasn't absolutely necessary. It was just a different mentality back in those days. No wasted motion, all that kind of stuff. And believe me, I love the flashy stuff. I mean, you saw that with Pistol Pete. You saw that with Sham God. Sham God created a move that people still use to this day, but you just don't see that. You just didn't see that as often in the 80s and 90s, but now, it's a popular thing. Well, I mean, Pistol Pete, obviously Maravich was in the 60s and 70s, for Christ's sake. So don't tell me people back then didn't have handles, including, Michael Jordan. I've seen some of his drills as well. So it's not that, it's not there. It just wasn't used as often. It's just not, they didn't take three-pointers that often. The basic play was come down and feed the ball to the big man to get the high percentage shot. That was the mentality of the game. Now, of course, Tex Winter and those guys who created the triangle offense that was used in some small colleges brought that to the Bulls, and the triangle offense changed a lot of that as well, changed the game in a big way. And then, of course, that carried over to the later Lakers when Phil Jackson moved over there and implemented the triangle offense with Kobe. So anyway, I hope the younger generation will watch this and gain some type of appreciation and kind of get a better understanding of what we're talking about when we have all these arguments about this era versus that era and this player versus that player and the time of the guard versus the old big man days. Because think about this. You take somebody like Shaquille O'Neal and you put him in the middle of the paint in today's game. I don't know if they would know what to do. It would slow the game down so much because Shaq is such a dominant force in the center of the paint. It would not be the same game. I don't know if the Warriors in their heyday or whatever would know how to quite deal with a Shaq-led basketball team. I don't know if they would know how to deal with that. You know what I mean? It's a whole different thing when you have a big man in there and then at the same time have hand-checking rules and all that kind of stuff. So it's not a knock on today's game by any means. I'm just saying it's completely different, and I just hopefully people can start kind of to understand that. So anyway, guys, if you guys enjoyed this video, give me a like and let me know, and I'll do it again next week. In the meantime, click right over here for our latest episode on the Tiger King podcast, or you can click right over here and check out our latest episode on Game of Thrones Season 8, Episode 3, our rewrite series, where we're kind of trying to fix Game of Thrones, at least in our own heads. So anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.